Stewart, also known as Citizen Stewart, about a lot of different issues facing education and particularly parents and families today. We're going to address some ideas related to school choice. We're going to address some ideas related to how schools do or don't serve their communities, and a little bit of wherever else we go here. Real quick, give some context. I first became aware of Chris and his work and his advocacy when he made a Twitter post back on November 26th, 2020, about 10 education truths. And it was awesome because it's a list of 10 things, most of which I think are truths. And I agree with probably over half of them, but I think all 10 are things worthy of discussion, right? And the reason it popped up on my timeline there is because so many people I know, teachers or people interested, were responding, and almost all responding negatively. And I thought, like, any guy who cares enough about education to say it and then to back it up and argue with the teachers about it, like, that's somebody I'm paying attention to. So we started following then and all the rest. So Chris, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk. How are you doing today?
I'm great, and I'm excited to be here. So thanks for the invitation.
So awesome. And you know, I'm not going to necessarily go through the list of the 10 truths. I probably couldn't even find it at this point, but a lot of it just had to do with sort of calling into question sort of the traditional beliefs we have. I remember that someone I knew got upset about was the idea that teachers know best, and that, you know, teachers know best, they're the experts in this. And I don't remember how you phrased it, but it was essentially that, like, we're not necessarily attracting the best and the brightest, which is a big problem that I have. You know, like, as a teacher, I teach high school. And I think that one of the easiest things that we could do is I don't want to say easiest, but one of the first things we should do is find ways to attract better talent to the teaching pool. And so for you, what does that mean? Like, would you agree with that idea that we can attract better teachers? Would that be a priority?
Yeah, I think it's a big priority because I think, number one, teachers are the biggest investment that school districts make into the education of children. So the salaries and the benefits of teachers is like one of the major strategies for outcomes. Like, if you wanted to look at a budget and say, I want to put my money where my mouth is, I really want kids to learn, you would invest in teachers. You would hire teachers, and then you would provide them with what they needed, the resources that they needed to actually teach. Now, the quality of the people that you attract to do that role is also going to be the quality of your strategy. So if you have a real low bar for that, which some schools and some districts do, there goes your strategy. If you have a real high bar, like Finland does, and Singapore and some of the leading nations of the world do, well, then your strategy increases. I think the tweet you're talking about, though, really did anger a lot of people, because what I said in the tweet was, like, teachers love to say that. I didn't say this exactly like this, but teachers do love to say, we know best. We're the experts. Just leave us alone and let us teach. And as a person of color, as a parent of color who's been a parent for 3 decades and has been through many teachers now, I can tell you that that's not true, and that not all teachers are created equal, right? And I don't think teachers know. They think that we don't know what they see because they see different kids every year. So they say, well, you don't know what I see. As a parent for 3 decades with 5 kids going through multiple school systems and many teachers, I can guarantee you haven't seen what I've seen either.
That's really interesting, actually, when you think about it that way. Like, yeah, how and so you said 5 kids.
5 kids. The oldest is 30, the youngest is 10.
Oh man, you're a
so
saint.
I've done Power Rangers multiple times. I've done Barney multiple times. I've done Care Bears a couple of times.
You're catching He-Man as it's coming back, like
back again.
Yeah,
some of these things leave and come back.
And that's a fair point, because I say this a lot when I talk about other teachers, when I'm talking to my students about how's school going, you know, and a lot of times just to maintain some element of professionalism, like I say, you know, I ask about other classes and things, but I usually say like don't name names. And they usually do anyway, but like the goal isn't to like get dirt on another teacher. It's just, how's school going for you? You know, how's your learning going? And it's always difficult, because I always say, you know, if a kid says it once, you listen, but you don't freak out. But when you hear 10 different kids who you think are all decent, reliable people, when you hear 10 different kids all say the same thing, like, I'm drawing conclusions about that other teacher's class.
Yeah.
I've never been in it, but you can only hear the thing so many times before you have to assume there's at least some truth to it. And maybe that's a fair way to think about the parent perspective, particularly if you're a parent with multiple kids going through the school system, right?
Yeah. Well, let me drive the point home just real quickly. Having been a former school board member too, you would ask principals about their teachers, and principals can predict each year which teacher is going to have what problems. Like if they had to guess at the beginning of the year which teacher was going to send them the most students for disciplinary reasons, right? But just for some reason, I could guess that these two teachers are going to send me way more than anybody else. You have to ask the question, well, why is that?
Yeah.
Why can you predict that with pretty good accuracy that teacher A is not going to send you almost anyone ever, and teacher B is going to send you someone every 30 seconds. And you know, as a parent, I'll drive it home. The district that I live in, at the open house at the beginning of the year, parents come for an open house and go from classroom to classroom, and you can choose teachers. Like you can rank and choose teachers after you meet with them in their classroom.
Okay.
And year after year, the middle class parents choose the same teachers. And the teachers that don't get chosen the most end up with a classroom full of kids that need more, often are English as second language. And it's just so weird how no one can really judge. You know, we say we can't evaluate teachers. You know, there's no real instrument to do it. But it's just weird how all those parents pick the same people. And those people tend to be the most senior, the most confident, and their classrooms look like places where learning happens. There was one classroom I walked in one time, same school as everybody else. And I was like, oh, hell no. Right? It was like the first words that came out of my mouth. And you could just tell that the kids were going to be bored to death in that particular classroom.
I mean, that's interesting too. You think about like, you know, how you can choose the teacher. I always say, you know, when I'm talking to teachers or when I'm advising, say, new teachers and taking on the mentor role, I always tell them one of the most important days of the whole year is that open house, that back to school night, because like your job is to sell. If the parents believe in you on that day, you're only going to get purposeful emails after that. If they walk out thinking like, what is going on with this knucklehead, expect that you just doubled or tripled the amount of communication you're going to have going on. Communication is good, but it should be purposeful, you know? And so in that setting, it's interesting the different ways people would present themselves. It's also difficult because I think that sometimes some of the students you just referenced, say your ELL students, poorer students, parents working two jobs and things, those are the students whose parents show up less often. Right. And so you're not getting even a fair representation of the parents across the different demographics in your school. And so if that's something you're going to use either to schedule students or even to evaluate the teachers, you know, I would argue that that's a questionable metric just because not everybody can get to those events or, you know, not everybody's as comfortable at them. You know, you're not looking for the same things. That's tricky. Before we go on, because I really like sort of where we're heading with this, but just to start on common ground, I want to ask you what is becoming one of the big questions of this podcast. And that is, to you, what is the purpose of education? And when I say that, I mean formal education. So whatever formal kind of schooling or whatever you're thinking about, what is the purpose of that as an institution?
So first, I love the question. I would say I don't make a big difference between formal and informal education for one reason only, because to answer the question directly, I think that education is synonymous with human development. So basically, education just is human development. So God delivers a baby into my hand, that I look at that baby and I think by the time that you are 18 years old, there's going to be a lot of intellectual development happening, and I'm the president of that process. And I need to find you people to facilitate that process, because from this day that you're a baby to the day that you are like eating in my basement as a 20-something-year-old.
Get out of here.
Yeah, I need to just make sure that your growth is optimal, meaning whatever it is that is in you that needs to be pulled out, whether you are an artist or a dentist or a puzzle maker or whatever it is that's in you, the process of drawing it out and preparing you for a personally meaningful life is education. And that could be through public schools with teachers. That could be through private schools with teachers. That could be through unschools or homeschools or schools in the wilderness, schools on wheels. It could be whatever it is that looks optimal. And the person who should know what's optimal should be me, because I have 5 kids. They're different. They're very different. I would do parenting differently today than I would would have done with my one who's 30, for instance. I've learned a lot.
Yeah, that's the trial and error sort of nature of it. I love the answer, and that my answer shifts a little bit. I feel like every couple episodes I talk to people and I rethink it, but the best answer that I've come up with is that education, I like the human development piece, but it's whatever you can do to empower and uplift an individual, and hopefully you can do it in such a way that it also uplifts the community that individual lives in. Like, that not that we have to turn everyone into a public servant directly, but if we're really doing our jobs, you should be a better person for our efforts when we're all done, and hopefully other people around you benefit from it. And so I love sort of what you're saying there. I've had previous guests on, we've done unschooling, we've done some homeschooling, world schooling, all this kind of stuff. And one of my goals for this year was to get a little bit more into the details of the concept of choice, because on its surface, phrased as simply as possible, parents should have choice in what their kids are doing. I'm like, yeah, I'm in. I get hung up on details about how we do that equitably, right? How do, in terms of whether it's a funding issue or thinking about special education needs and all that kind of stuff. There are a lot of different ways to deliver these services to young people, but putting the parents in charge sounds good, right? I also then think about some of my students who are probably the neediest or who I have to keep the closest eye on. And sometimes that's because, I don't know what's going on at home, but sometimes the kids who need the most from me at school are the kids who are not getting the most at home, right? And so I worry about the concept of school choice, because if you're putting choice in the hands of responsible people making great decisions, then this is good. But then I also think about, what about those kids who don't have that? When you've had discussions about school choice or about helping parents, families to find the right place for them, how do you navigate that part of the discussion? Like how much influence should the community have versus how much autonomy should the parent have to make that choice?
First of all, bottom line, by grace of God and by color of law, parents are ultimately responsible for the intellectual development of children. So there is no getting around it. So there is no other world in which there's some other authority that's supposed to be. So to the extent that there is some world in which other people feel like it's their job to intervene on that, like most basics of rights, to me, that's illegitimate power. It's illegitimate social power. It's classist, and it's oftentimes racist, and colorist, and all kinds of other ists, sometimes sexist. So there's all kinds of problems with that. There is a reality that not all parents are equally suited to do what you can do for your kids. The millionaire down the street and the thousandaire down the street and the person who's 4 weeks behind on their rent have different life situations going on. So it's going to affect their ability of what they can do with their kids. So clearly that will be an imbalance that's there. What public education has done over a long period of time has made parents infantile. It has infantilized parents of all classes, even middle class parents to some degree. Save the ones who become helicopter parents. The other ones kind of drop their kids off oftentimes and just expect the schools to do their magic, expect their kids to come home and then go to college, and then that's it. That's just life, right? Without oftentimes looking into some of the measurements that their kids aren't even growing. Even though they're proficient on tests, they're not growing in the way that they should be growing. So I do believe that right now there's some muscles that parents aren't using that have atrophied, and they become more and more helpless because the government system of schools has over time professionalized them out of the educational equation. Much of what we call education is premised on the idea of educating the kid in spite of the parent, right? Like not with the parent, but in spite of the parent. We're going to educate your kid, damn it, in spite of you, because you're so fill in the blank with a million deficiencies,
Right.
Here's where I have sympathy for the question. I think it would take time. The more you would empower parents, the more they use the muscles that they're supposed to be using anyways, that they're not right now. Mm-hmm. The more that they know that they're ultimately responsible, the more they will use muscles they've never used before. They will become less and less infantile and more responsible. But we need public policy to put them on the hook for that. We need social mores to put them on the hook for that. And we're just not there yet. I do believe that COVID has shocked a lot of parents into responsibility, right? So COVID is the first time the government has said, here's your kids, we're not open for business right now. We're going to need you just to go ahead and keep them at home, and we'll check in with you later.
Turn the computer on, but the rest is on you. Yeah,
right. And parents are at home now, like, well, damn, did I sign up for this? And you're like, when you became a parent?
Yeah. Well, you know what? Like, I mean, so I'm in Northern Virginia, and we got a snowstorm going on right now, and they cancel school today. They cancel school tomorrow, and disregard the fact, we've got pandemic and distance learning and all the rest. That's always been one of my favorite things, is when you catch a snow day, in years past, everyone's like, okay, but you get a big storm, you get like 2 or 3 in a row. And by about the third day, you have parents screaming. And the funniest part is, you look in like the online forums, and the loudest ones are like stay-at-home parents who are like, I can't deal with these kids like that. Like, what are you doing? I'm like, they are your kids. I mean, don't get me wrong. Like, they should be in school. That's fine. But they are your kids. Like, if you can't spend 3 days with them, that is not the school's problem, in the moment. And I think there's a lot of truth in everything you're saying. The question, again, I think is sort of, how do you do it, or maybe get back to it in a way? It's easy to forget that our public school system in its current form is only, 100, 120 years old, older in some places. But, if you think sort of big picture, most of the citizens of this country 150 years ago didn't have access to a legitimate public school, or not beyond the first few grades, and so all of this is kind of a relatively recent experiment. The problem, I think, is that we have very short memories. And so if you grew up going to school, you assume your kid's going to school. And so I think people don't question the institution of school, which to my point, the whole point of the podcast is to say, like, there's a million ways that we could do this, and there's probably some really good ones we haven't considered. Right. And so I'm trying to figure out, like, what are those options, and how do we get that word out? But if you grow up with something, you assume it's normal, you don't question it. The pandemic has flipped that. And I think that the idea of, say, school choice has probably more backing right now than I've ever heard, in my lifetime. And I think it's a healthy discussion. Do you think it's possible, given the current climate, given your experiences advocating, talking with families and the rest, do you think that we can actually have a real public sort of choice system, whether it's vouchers or, skip the details for a moment? Do you think that this is something that can actually happen in the United States, large scale, wide scale, in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I don't know about 5 years, but I do think it's inevitable. I do think that it's coming. It's been a slow growth, but it's been happening in small programs already. And if you look state to state, the type of choice programs that they have installed at the state level, there's places like Florida where it's kind of like a choice bonanza, and Ohio has gone pretty much kind of choice bonanza also. You have middling states, kind of like Nevada and in California, which has a large system of charter schools. I think it's the largest or the second largest charter market. You have lots of choice programs that people don't know about that are aimed at people with disabilities, to get private school education, or low-income kids, like Cincinnati. I think it's Cincinnati or Cleveland, definitely Milwaukee. You've probably heard about the Milwaukee experiment. So it's happened at municipal levels, at state levels. It hasn't happened in total, save what some people might say about New Orleans, for instance, which, they had a massive kind of upset of their old school system because of a hurricane, that had never been before. And I grew up in New Orleans, so I mean, it was funny. Not funny, but I mean, there were multiple, not haha funny, but there were like there were people who weren't going to leave for Katrina, because New Orleans has been through big hurricanes before. The old folks will tell you about, Hurricane Camille and Betsy. These were bad ones. So Katrina was a once in a lifetime event for that city. So that they have a whole different school system now, of choice, came out of pretty bad situation, but it's possible. I guess that's the answer to your question. Yes, it's possible. I think it's inevitable. I think one of the things that we're not going to pay attention to, because there are lagging indicators, but so I'm Gen X, and then you have Gen Y and Z, and in the pipeline, you have A starting again.
Double A. Yeah.
Ooh, my God, that's going to be a doozy. But these are hyper personalized, hyper customized lifestyles that they are starting to live now. The idea that you have one of anything, that you have one choice of anything, is soon to lose favor. I believe it's a prediction. People have made that prediction before. But my generation, for instance, Gen X, is way more choice friendly than the generation before me.
Right.
Right. Like way more. It's way more of an option for me than it ever was for them. And even stuff like homeschooling and unschooling and all of that stuff, boy, the boomers probably will explode if you talk about that type of thing. Like, what are you doing to my grandchildren?
It's funny.
So.
I talked to my mom. She went to Catholic school in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And so I was asking her about this just because I was like, how did that work? I was like, because like your parents didn't pay. She's one of 5 kids. I was like, they didn't pay, right? And she goes, no, it was all paid for. And I said, who paid for it? And she goes, well, I know they didn't. And I know that Catholic kids got it for free. She goes, but I always thought the city was paying for it. And I was like,
yeah,
I'm not saying that's not possible. I'm just saying, like, I don't understand like the tool you would use to sort of move the public funds into the private school like that. And then she sort of talked through, she's like, all I know is after I left, because I have 2 older sisters, and she talked about how their options were very different than hers were, how the funding structure, even within the Catholic Church, was very different. She's like, whether or not there was any public money, the way the church was funding the school changed, which changed who had access. And while there's still scholarships for your less privileged students, she's like, there's still, there are bigger gaps than there used to be. And so she has this like very sort of different view on it. And when I mentioned this, it was a few days ago, we were talking about this, but I used the phrase school choice, and she sort of like grunted at it, like, ugh. But I also know that she went to a private school and gave me the choice, because I went to Catholic church until, I don't know, I gave up on it at some point, but she gave me the choice to go to the Catholic school. And I'm like, well, you gave me the choice. And she's like, yeah, but it's different. And I was like, different how? And she didn't even know what that meant. And I don't know how much of that is like an age issue versus an understanding of the issues of school choice. That's, for me, that's the part I'm trying to sort out, because I think if we can sort out who has access and how do we use public funds responsibly, like how can we make sure it's a responsible use of funds? And
I mean, who are the funds for? I guess you have to ask the question, like, when I say per pupil income, I mean per pupil. I don't mean per system.
Right.
So when we say spend funds responsibly, we never say that about Pell Grants or Section 8 or food stamps, other things. We just give the person their money and let them go grocery shopping and let them go apartment shopping.
I've had more than one conversation with somebody talking about how they saw someone else spending their food stamps.
Okay. I mean, there are jackasses in the world who are like that busybody that they're worried about. Like, you're getting steak and lobster. They're getting steak and lobster and food stamps. And you're like, really? Where? I worked for 10 years in the welfare system, part of which was helping low-income women find housing, find jobs. I'd have to take them shopping at times and find schools. And it was always interesting to me, the behavioral economics of watching them over a period of time and just learning the difference between what they're really living and experiencing versus what the public, especially the kind of arrogant middle-class public, thinks that they're doing. And to the way that they're making decisions, I thought was always really interesting, including, food and where they wanted to live. Like if you were looking for apartments and all that, it's just really interesting, their behavioral economics. But I do know most of those systems, you could take the money out of their hands, food stamps and Section 8 and all that stuff. And I don't think they would get a better benefit out of it if they weren't deciding. And if they didn't have perfect buy-in for what it was that they decided. I think school choice has been politicized to the point where it's just really hard to even talk about it, like just openly just talk about it. People's politics, I think, enter pretty quickly.
Yeah, well, and that, I mean, I'm glad you said that, because that's kind of what I run into. Like, I'm a public school teacher, right? So I know where I work. I know where my paycheck comes from. I also have a pretty clear, I hope, maybe evolving, but a relatively clear understanding of what I'm trying to do. Like the goal is to help each individual who walks in the door, to take advantage of whatever opportunities I have to help that person. And I think that the idea that we could have a different door, and as a result have either different students or maybe the same students who feel differently about the opportunity, just the idea that I chose to be here versus I have to be here can yield massive differences in the result, and I'm very careful about how I say things in class. Like I phrase everything like it's a choice, even when it's not. Kids are like, do I have to do it? I'm like, no, you don't have to do it. What's it going to do to my grade? Well, your grade is a matter of policy that's out of my hands, but you will decide what you want to do. I wish I had a little more freedom in how in the options I get to express, and so that's where I get stuck. Cause I think as a person politically, who's very sort of independent, like I align all over the place. I think the idea is good. I think that every time I ask questions about the details, and I don't mean to put, I'm not saying you're the guy who has to do that, but when I have these conversations and it gets the details, I feel like a lot of people sort of brush them off. And the assumption is if from people who are pro-choice, they say, yeah, but look, what you already have isn't that good. And you have people who are anti, and they immediately go to the potential problems with, either socioeconomic status or racism or just access within a community and things like that. And it's not that they're unfair questions, but they're asking the question because they're trying to torpedo the idea before you even really had the discussion. And so my feeling is when I talk to people who are pro school choice, you end up with this discussion of the broad ideas of choice. And on the other side, everything is about subverting the issue. And so I don't feel like I get to have too many honest discussions about it.
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by that, though, because the details to me are pretty clear. Like we have government programs in many different sectors. We have ways to administer them. And if it's about giving people money so that they can achieve an essential service, we have like models for that already. Like in other, so if it's just the details of like administratively, how would we make it happen? Well, that's not rocket science. It's like,
the
that's
government's
easy enough.
Good at mailing checks. That's one of the things they are.
Or they put it on a card or something like that, and they provide you with a clearinghouse of vendors or choices. Like here are your options. Here are people that accept what it is that we're giving you. There are states that are already doing it, kind of in a trial run, like on small scales. All it takes is a change of will. Do
you think that's the way to go though? Like first, like doing say like the quote unquote the prepaid card, and here are approved institutions. Here's the places that you can go spend these dollars. Do you think that is the direction that we're either going to go or that we should go?
I do. I definitely do, and I think the hard political part of the conversation for me is like for all the time. Like marriage equality right now, for instance, an issue is no longer an issue. It's law now. But the arguments that we had running up to it were just like school choice. Like it's so inane to like think that we had to actually convince people that it was a right to marry who we want. But they had so many reasons why it would destroy our institutions. It would, break down society. It would change the world.
Destroy the fabric of the universe.
It's going to destroy my heterosexual marriage. If you have the right to do what you want to do with your own partner, it's going to somehow affect me. Those arguments felt legitimate. They literally felt legitimate not that long ago. Yeah. And that's where I think we are with the school choice argument, the fear mongering, the bottom line with most of these things. And I'm glad your friend is a libertarian because I have a lot of respect for that now. Because like with reproductive rights, with marriage rights, with how you live your life, all of those things, there is a good argument to be had that government should be able to regulate and tell you how to do those things. There will always be a good argument that could be made. They will always be wrong, though. Like they will always be wrong because they're messing with your essential freedoms, the freedom of your body, the freedom of your mind, the freedom of your person and your privacy, and all those things are they're uniquely human in this particular society because we say we honor all those things. We say our Constitution just honors those things, and we talk in such flowery language that you would believe it. But when it comes to school choice, it's just like, I don't know, man. Like, God, parents would do so poorly, and the poor would do so, they may not, it's kind of like, I do feel like what you said just a minute ago is part of the argument of like, so you think they're doing great right now? Right? Like,
what's that?
The underclassed, under-resourced communities and kids in American public schools are being put on tracks. They're being redlined into districts gerrymandered
Oh yeah,
educational
yeah. I mean,
districts like
people are
crazy.
getting railroaded right into their doom. Yeah,
Entire system's rigged. Like all you have to do is look at the blueprint of your city and your state and show me the boundaries of everything, and I'll tell you exactly what you're intending to do with those kids.
yeah. Well,
Um,
and see, that's where for me, like, this is one of the primary reasons I think choice is important, because if you're rich, you already have choice. Like
mhm.
rich people have choice,
Not
and
just
so
rich,
yeah,
not
well,
just rich,
you
middle
got you
class.
probably got to hit upper middle class. I mean, maybe it depends area to area, but you know, you
Yeah.
could, I guess, a middle class family who's willing to make some big sacrifices in other places. Yes, you could do that, and it's probably one of the things that is worth sacrificing for.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, I think the people who I see, thinking about where I grew up, where I live, where I work, the people who I see exercising that choice are at the top end of middle class and up for the most part, unless they're doing it specifically for a religious purpose. They tend to sort of fall into that place where it's sort of a luxury.
Are you saying, like, when you say that, do you mean they're choosing private schools? They're not choosing like
Almost always.
high end public schools.
No, yeah. They're choosing private.
Yeah, because
schools.
that's the other type of choice I'm talking about. Is suburban choice, where you move.
Well, yeah, you move
and
to the
go get a
neighborhoods,
mortgage.
yeah, and that's
Yeah,
well, and
yeah,
that's where
yeah.
I work. I mean, where I work, you know, I'd say the other side of the mountain. I live in a much smaller, far more legitimately middle class place. But where I work is Loudoun County, Virginia, which is by household income, it's the wealthiest county in the country. It's all new money. Like you don't, you know.
Oh, the Loudoun School District.
Yeah.
Right.
So,
Okay, come on
you know,
now.
they've been
Come
all
on.
over the news lately because of people yelling at the school board and you know all kinds of stuff. So, you
That's
know,
school choice.
but they're
right there.
like, oh yeah, and you know, I made the choice to move the county over just 'cause I couldn't afford to live there.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm like, I'm teaching there. I'm living the next county over. You know, and people, there are people in that community who are talking about, you know, if schools aren't open 5 days a week next year, we're going to move, and they have the ability to do that. They have that privilege that comes with the ability. Hey, I'm just going to move to find the schools. There are not a ton of private schools in the area. There are very few charter schools. So you know, you sort of move into a place that has, you know, pretty good public schools, but there aren't a ton of other options, and you now have people considering what that means. My goal in the idea of school choice is that, like, can we effectively provide that same level of choice to less privileged families? Like, can we do that? And then I think about the reverse side, like in where I live, which is a very small sort of rural community, agricultural area, one high school for the entire county, you know, and there's a private school. It's a small private school. It's very expensive. And it's only, I think, up through like 8th grade or something. There isn't really an opportunity for choice there. Now, we always say, hey, you know, you could innovate. Someone could open the school. If the money's there, someone could do it. But you have such a small population. Like a rural community could actually face the opposite sort of problem where you say, hey, we can give you the funding. We can give you vouchers or whatever. You don't have the population base to sustain it. If you split between a public school and a private school and you do a legit 50-50 split, neither one of them is likely to come out successful because you don't have the revenue to sort of run it. It doesn't mean that you can't make it work. I just think that the discussion about school choice in a city or in a wealthy suburb like where I work plays out a lot differently than in that small rural community where you don't have that population base to really sustain the multiple options. And so when we think about, you know, say in terms of the funding, like this is a question I get stuck on, and this would be as big a problem in a city as it would be in the countryside or whatever else. But like, how do you think, or you know more about this than I do, so maybe how do places already handle this in terms of, say, special education funding? Because your average special education student is you know, receiving additional man hours and additional services, additional technology in the school. So when somebody says, we'll just cut everybody a check for $12,000 a kid, you know, I'm like, well, your gen ed kids really only getting 8 of that because their special education students getting a lot more. Like, how should that work? Or maybe for whatever you think, you know, the ideal systems are, the ones that you've looked at, how do they adjust for that?
Well, I think it's interesting that they're already, special education kids are probably getting more of the school choice dollars now than anyone else. I think possibly because it's easier to pass state school choice laws that are specifically for kids that have very specific disabilities or are in poverty. So I do know, like, if you go to Ed Choice's website, they kind of have like a national map of the different kinds of school choice that states have passed. And I was kind of shocked by the number of them that are specifically special education. And I think part of that also is that there are states where the public schools for certain kinds of special education needs have thrown their hands up and said, we'll never have enough kids to be able to do an economy of scale for that particular, disability. So it might as well just pay for that kid to go to some special provider. And you see that in states now, like that's already part of the landscape. I could just see you expanding it more. I mean, listen, the idea that the system would be ready on day one is not realistic. Like, I think I do believe markets open up when you have new influx of people who want to consume something. So for instance, if you had a lot of people with a coupon today that they didn't have yesterday, there'd be a little bit more inspiration to say, okay, well, we want to set up a school for those people, right?
A few new buyers.
Yeah. And the rural, suburban, urban thing is interesting too. But the one size fits all model that we have right now, and the consolidation happy model, I mean, we have twice the number of students today and half the number of schools since the 50s. So the consolidation boom actually, I think, ruined a big part of public education. The whole economy is of scale. We're going to have one high school for like 3 county type of thing or whatever. That was never good. That wasn't smart. That was actually that actually, I think, accelerated the depersonalization of education. Yeah. And the over compartmentalization of subject matter within schools came out of that big kind of consolidation boom,
Yeah, I love that you bring that up. That's actually been very unintentionally one of the recurring themes in this podcast is whether the idea of keeping your separate disciplines and subject areas is even a valid way to continue to teach kids who have access to all kinds of knowledge and technology just, in their phone, in their pocket. Mm-hmm. Does it really make sense to treat English and history like they're always different things when really those skills overlap significantly? And, and it keeps coming up, like you just said it over and over again. And so that's one of the things where I'm like, well, regardless of who's paying for the school or what kind of school it is, I don't know that that's sustainable or that is a reflection of the way students learn or the world we live in. But you're right. It sure makes for easy organization. Right. And so your point with the consolidating schools, this has always been sort of a utilitarian institution, but I feel like that utilitarian piece has gotten more and more intense. Mm-hmm. Right at a time when we probably would benefit from more and more specialization. And that is for me, the thing that has evolved most in having these conversations is how important it is and all the different ways that we could specialize for different needs, for different career paths, for whatever it may be. But current educational policy and legislation is probably never going to allow for what I envision for that sort of specialization, and that's where I'm hung up in between.
Yeah, I definitely don't think that people in current school systems should be the ones who make the next school system. Actually, I just don't like the orientation, the training, the thought processes. You can't solve problems at the same level that you created them. And the kind of factory model, which people, I had an argument recently on one of my podcasts with someone who hates this concept of the factory model and says it's completely not true and whatnot. And it just so is. One of the weirdest and most ironic thing about public education is that the 13 years that you are in public schools, the one thing that they don't teach you is actually the actual history of public schools.
Oh yeah.
The actual history of the institution that you're in. Right?
And I would argue that's intentional.
That is, I would more than argue that it's intentional. I would say it's obviously intentional because if you knew the actual history of public schools, you would never see it as humane to put your kids in them, right? They are actually not meant. They're administrative states, these little administrative states that are literally trying to Americanize your kids and make them one rather than make them like themselves. And there are even some ethics, for libertarians, there are even some ethics questions about a government that trains its own bosses, right? Yeah. The idea that we're supposed to be governed by consent. But if you were training the people that you were supposed to be getting to be the consent from, there's a kind of a problem with that. That would be like Monsanto raising the next employees of the EPA, right? Yeah. It doesn't really make sense. And I would say that less if this, just one, because that'll sound out there for some people. But if people were leaving schools and reading books for the rest of their lives and were really turned on educationally and very active, if we hadn't just seen a million moron march in Washington, D.C., try and take over the Capitol because they think that somebody's like sex trafficking kids out of a Pizza Hut. Like, then I would say the education system is worth its salt. But the number of people who never, as adults, never ever read a book again after high school is astounding.
Yeah.
Right. Like in an information society, ignorance is a choice, and we are choosing it over and over and over again. And you have to start wondering about those 13 years. What takes place in the 13 years that makes you never want to read a book again for the rest of your life?
Makes you never want to learn another thing. Yeah.
I'm done, man.
And I mean, it's a fair point. So I was talking with a friend, and we actually had this conversation from both sides where I'm like, there are some parts of the country and it's a little bit all over where I would worry about sort of the ideological bent of what you're going to get in terms of that private school, that if we're going to deny other people their human rights, or we're going to deny accepted science or whatever it may be, and you can just take your dollars to that institution and do it, but then I hit my sticking point. I go, well, but rich people can already do it. So why shouldn't everyone else be entitled to the same mistake? But on the flip side of it, you say, well, you got everybody running through schools with, hopefully in most places, at least a decent sort of representation of current science and the concepts of human rights and, all this, and people are still walking out of school doing a terrible job with it. And so, if we're already not school, doing it,
not able to define the three branches of government, they're walking out of school not being, in many cases, not being able to tell you who the vice president is sometimes.
Yeah.
And some basic rules of the Senate and the House. How a law becomes a law, there are people who pass citizenship tests who know more about the country than the people who have been here forever, right?
So that's it's funny you bring that up. That was I don't know if you know Jeremy Wayne Tate. He's the CEO of the CLT exam. So they've started a test that's supposed to be competing with the SAT and ACT, and it targets homeschool and generally like Christian private school kids, but they're big. The big push for sort of your traditional sort of liberal education and class. So they use the term classical education, things like that. But and I had a great talk with him on the podcast over the summer, and he's a really interesting guy. He hits a few ideas he just goes back to again and again on Twitter. I think just because he knows it gets likes and whatever. But one of the big ones is he always floats this article about how few people can pass a citizenship test today, but how most of their grandparents can and why that is. And he uses that as an indication of like, this is a downfall of schools. I'm like, wow, this is a problem. I also don't know if I'd use the citizenship test as an indication of how well prepared students are to, do any number of things, but it is a question of like, what should kids learn in school? And so, I'll take that moment to kick it to you. If you ran a school, right? So people can choose whatever, let's say school choices, the menu's there, right? And people could choose it. But let's say somebody grabbed you and said, hey, you get to run this school, whatever you have in mind. Okay. The students are going to bring the funding through whatever voucher system's available. What would you do? Like, what would your school look like? Like you mentioned, schools on wheels, schools in the forest, whatever.
Right.
You can do anything you want.
Yeah.
To provide an education that you believe in. What would your ideal school look like?
Man, that's a powerful question too, because I've visited so many schools over the years that I haven't found a perfect one, but I've found bits and pieces of different ones where I've went like, oh, that one thing is cool, but the other stuff is bad. Right. like there's always an upside and a downside. I definitely believe in things like I believe that every kid should have an IEP. Like I think that every kid should have an individual education plan, co-written by their parents and by educators together. Updated each year and with a strong emphasis on doing. So definitely a lot of project-based apprenticeships, experiential things, depending on the grades that you're in. In younger grades, just a lot of exploration of self and the world to kind of start seeing where a person's talents lie, where a person's, inclinations lie, and then a plan for how to personalize their education year by year. And at the point of which they can start being the author of their own doing, like, I'm older now than middle school. I can start kind of seeing that I actually have a predilection for, sports or art or geography or whatever. Then to start introducing them into the fields of which it looks like they have the talents for, right? Like I have a friend who is a cartographer, And when he first told me that, I didn't know what a cartographer was. I'm like, what is that
I,
mess?
I know what a cartographer is, and I'm thinking in the modern world, like, what, is he just making like art for fancy living rooms? Because
he's
like,
designing subway systems
okay.
for
Like,
entire nations in
awesome.
some cases, and he's doing it in ways in which the average person can look at his schematics and know what's going on. Like, he's taking very complex things and making them super simple.
Yeah,
Which read, I didn't know was an art, but it is an art apparently. Nothing he learned in high school, something he picked up while in college, and then shifted his college education towards that, and immediately was able to do very well on his own. He doesn't have to work for anybody. I look at examples like him, and I could give others. I don't want to fill up the time with that, but these are people who self-actualized at some point into a thing that you would never in a million years have thought of yourself. Like, how did you know to do that? One person I point to, I will mention one more. I don't know how much into tech you are, or into YouTubers, but there's a YouTuber named Marques Brownlee, right? So Marques Brownlee started in his bedroom with 10 years ago. He's 26. He's a millionaire. But 10 years ago at 16, in his room with a little jacked up camera, he had gotten a one of those, I want to say it's the droid phone, one of the first ones where you flip it up and you could, whatever. And he was doing reviews on those. He now has an enterprise where he's like still on YouTube all these years. If you watch throughout the years, you see him go from his bedroom to his college dorm room to an official studio. And he's interviewing Bill Gates now and Elon Musk and whatnot. And if you were to ask him, what made you think that like being a YouTuber, a tech YouTuber, as a black kid from New Jersey, would be the way? He had self-actualizing experiences along the way and whatnot. So when you ask me about my school, I can't tell you all the pieces because it wouldn't be a set curriculum. It wouldn't be like Montessori or Waldorf or a set way. But the most set thing would be that the emphasis would be on your intellectual development, like education as your development, and the byproduct, the flowers that you would want to see bloom would be like people like Marques, and people who are doing something that maybe your typical high school couldn't have prepared you to do.
Yeah, and I mean, I love the answer, and it's thoughtful but vague, but I think that's probably the right way to be. And so I'm not going to press you on it because I think those details vary so much. One of the things that, as I ask this question over and over again, I keep hearing different ideas, and like the only thing that I can think that, for me, I think everybody should have a literacy class and a numeracy class. And I didn't say like English, you can read comic books, you can read manuals. You need to be able to read and think about what you've read and understand it. And you need to be able to manipulate numbers. Like, not everybody has to take calculus, but you need to be able, like, if somebody puts some numbers in front of you, you need to be able to handle that. And if you could do those two things, I think the rest of school could be exactly what you described. Anything, like, we need you to be able to manipulate words and numbers. And after that, find the things that work for you, because I don't remember, it was either the book Homo Deus, or it was might have been like Andrew Yang's book, the War on Normal People. One of the two, though, one of the two, they point out that all the current research, they look at like, what people studied in high school 20 years ago versus what you study now. And it's almost the exact same thing. Like, it's only shades of difference, but how different the job market is. And so right now, all the expert predictions are that, kids who are coming up through elementary, middle school now, they're going to have jobs in 20 years that don't exist today. Like, we're literally preparing people to do things in the world that don't exist in the world today. So how on earth could you ever hope to like target that? And I guarantee you the answer is not, separating the disciplines and sitting in desks and rows and that kind of stuff, which is where that flexibility could be really important. I'm curious about something you said in there with the idea of having kids sort of self-actualize and doing the independent piece, and again, that idea of empowering the individual family and the individual student for your own education. Yeah. How do you feel about your schooling? Like, what did you study? Like, what did you specialize in high school? What did you like, or what did you do in college, or what was your education like?
It was terrible. It was a catastrophe. Yeah, it was a catastrophe. It actually made me super militant about education when I became a dad. So I became a dad at 22. That was my first kid. And at that point, I was doing lots of service work, service industry work. And I was in, kind of in the life I was going to lead. Like, really, honestly, my 20s were a mess because of my educational experience. And the one thing that I knew with my firstborn was the one thing that I could do for him differently that breaks trends and breaks like cycles is to make sure that he gets a great K-12 education and then goes to college straight from K-12 and comes out the other end with a degree, right? Like, you couldn't have told me much else. That's as much as I had demystified about the world. But I did know that I was working for people that were able to do a lot more for their kids than I could. And they were living lives. I was working for them, let's just put it that way. And my bottom line was, I don't want my kid working for someone else in this kind of capacity. Like, I don't want this to be the thing. So my bad education became his good education, just in that I was militant year by year with him. And much the way that, I'm telling you, that I think is optimal is the sense that I had with him was like, you could be anything, man. You can do what you want. You can, just let's get you there and, whatever. And he was my learning experience, just in that I went to traditional public schools in 3 states, in Louisiana, California, and Minnesota. I got to see like very segregated, very Black schools in New Orleans, did 5th grade in Minnesota in a very white, very integrated, like the type of middle school I saw on TV. And then I moved to California and actually I did 4th grade in Minnesota, did 5th grade in California, and was bused to a school in Bel Air. So, talk about crazy, like coming from New Orleans. When I came to Minnesota, I thought these people were rich, and these people were really just straight up working class, middle class. Yeah. But then when I got to California, I got to see real rich people. I mean, like Burt Lancaster bought our buses, and they didn't want us at the school, but I got to see poor school, rich school, segregated, integrated. Got to see, did a year in Catholic school. And none of it was actually, to me, I got to see how much the system really was rigged, especially from going from poor schools to rich schools. Yeah. That was one way. As a kid, I even knew this whole thing now is BS. This whole thing, like when I saw the difference between what we were getting in New Orleans and what kids were getting in Los Angeles, it just was so clear to me that the whole system was rigged. So I carried that into adulthood and into being a dad. And my first one was my trial son. He was the one where we're going to try everything and learn some things. Figure it out. But man, like, listen, he made it all the way through, into middle school. We had some problems with the school situation. School choice saved us because we took him out of the district school that was like crazy failing, put him in a charter school where all the Black kids were doing very well. And that set him up for a full ride to a private high school on a scholarship. And then he went from there to a Benedictine college on a scholarship and came out the other end with his degree and left right after graduation and went and taught in South Korea and then in Chile. And this is at a time when I hadn't had any stamp in a passport yet. Right. Yeah. So that's the American dream right there. That's the dream, is that your kid will be self-actualized. And now he's one of these like, millennial dudes who's got his little apartment. He gets his food delivered and, he doesn't want to be tied down too much, likes to travel and takes life on his own terms, works from home in a job that high school could have never prepared him to do. Right. I mean, and his college totally didn't prepare him to do. That's my example.
Yeah, no, it's great. And by the way, I hope your son listens just to hear that incredible impersonation. That was awesome. No, but like, so thinking about your experience, your own experience through school, and then talking about your son's experience and changing schools and things like that. And you mentioned how different it is, economically in the first example. And then you pointed out how when you moved your son to a charter school, you said, this is a charter school that was serving Black students well. Mm-hmm. So I want to ask a question about that, just because sort of oddly over the summer, local guy I used to teach with, local football coach, fiery little Irish dude, great coach, good teacher. He was listening to like a lot of stuff in the news and looking at the protests. And he said, he goes straight up, he goes, I don't get it. I was like, get what? And he's like, get it. He's like, I mean, I get it. He's like, I just don't, he's like, I'm missing a lot of information here, and I don't think I'm going to get it if I don't ask. And so he created a group of guys that they've now labeled the Cookout. And it's a bunch of black men. There's one black young woman who I invited in, former student of mine. And there's, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 white dudes. I'm one of. And, every few weeks we get together and there's just sort of a talk, current events, whatever. A lot of it's gone to economic policy and sort of what can we do in the local community through uplifting black businesses in the community and things like that. And I'd asked them a few weeks ago before, we were set up to talk, but it just sort of asked them the idea, what do you think about how school choice could help or hurt black and brown students, just your non-white students writ large. And I got very different responses, and there were people who said, it's great because, what has this government ever really done to help black people? And so I don't trust that institution. Just as quick, I heard somebody else say, yeah, but any kind of funding system like that is just going to make it easier for someone else to say, my kid can't go to this school. You just pointed out how you said, you found a school that worked for your son and the results have been great. You were, no one's going to see the video. You're smiling ear to ear through parts of that story, right? What's your take on how this relates to race issues in this country? And maybe, thinking about those guys, we get together and we talk, what would you say to them in regard to the idea of having that flexibility and that choice? Is that a thing that is just good for everybody? Is it good for black students in particular? Like, how does race factor in?
Well, I would say this, I'm sick of people telling black folks that we're the only human population that does better with fewer choices, because white people in this country enjoy a lot of choices on everything. And success is kind of normalized around the idea that, hey, this didn't work out for me, so I got to do this. Well, that didn't work out for me, so I got to do this. And that's not just in school. That's in a lot of things, right? So I was in a bind when I had to find something for my kids. So talk to people when they're in a bind, not like when they're like being abstract about situations, but when they have a special education kid that's getting abused in their local neighborhood school and they don't feel like they have a way out, but they want one. And my 10 years in working in social services with women that were in that situation, I never found one who said, this situation would be better for me if I just had fewer choices. Right. As a matter of fact, it was my job to find options for them, like wherever, and it was my job to be able to say to them, listen, we know that landlord turned you down, but we're going to work hard and find you another landlord who will take you. Right. We know that your kid got that. You lost your job because that school is calling you every third day because they can't handle your son, but we're going to find a place for him or whatnot. And that required me to be the master of options. I had to be Mr. Choice. And it wasn't just for schools. It was also for everything else in the world. Right. But what I did know,
killer Rolodex by the end of that job.
Right. But I bet you if I asked you any of them, do white people have this same level of challenge that you do at the level that you do? Most of them would have said no. And most of them would have said it's easier being white because white people have choices. Yeah. Right. That's what it would have come down to. But I don't make it my job to convince anybody that they need something that I want. I try and convince people that we should just get out of each other's business. You may not need a different school. I might. You may not need a special education program. I might. You might not need an autism program. I might. You might not have a kid that actually is struggling and is going into the juvenile justice system because he's encountering too many police officers in his schools, but I might. Right. There's a school in Detroit where it's an inner city school. Inner city, I'm doing air quotes for people who are not who are not watching. But it's on a farm and it has farm animals and whatnot. And just the idea that these kids were getting out of their neighborhood school and kids with the most severest of discipline problems were getting out on the farm and making great kind of farm workers. And they eventually started a goat cheese business or something. They were teaching the kids entrepreneur, and the kids took to it, right? It eventually became a place where you put a lot of teen moms. If you had kept them in their regular school, they would have never even known that was possible. An option to go to a farm, be part of a different kind of system, be outside, breathe real air, and that whole thing. I couldn't have made somebody understand that until there was a need for them to understand it. That's the simplest way for me to put it.
That's good. No, and it's funny. There's a thing I say to students a lot that I've never connected to this topic, which now in retrospect makes me feel like a stupid person, which, is sometimes true. But I tell kids, they say all the time, well, knowledge is power. And I'm like, that's crap. Knowledge is inert. Like knowledge is useless if you can't do anything with it.
Right.
But knowledge creates options. The more things you know, then the more things you might choose to do.
Right.
Options create power. So when people tell you knowledge is power, they're lying to you, because knowledge on its own is just, I know a thing. Unless I see different ways that I can use it or choices I can make based on the knowledge, if I don't have options to use it, the knowledge itself was useless to me. Right.
That's great.
And so I tell students all the time, knowledge gives you the options, and then power comes from what you do with your options. And I feel dumb. I feel smart because I say that to kids and I feel good about it. I feel dumb because I've never once connected it back to discussion about sort of providing those options within the school system itself. Like what are those options available?
Well, ignorance, we should just say ignorance is not a bad thing. Ignorance is just a state. It's a state of being. It's not like calling someone a moron, Being ignorant is just like something we all are. We are all ignorant to something in life that someone could fill in the blanks for us for. But I will say this much. The story I gave you when I had to make that choice,
right? Because
we were at a serious dead end. My kid's life would be totally different if we would have went to the school that he was assigned to by the district. I can guarantee you that.
Right.
But it was white people who told me to do something different. He had friends. He was at a fairly integrated school in a special program on a special status. And some of the parents of his friends, when it came time to making that next decision, were the ones who whispered to me, like, kind of like, Chris, I would never do that. We love Josh. We love him. We would never, and you should probably look into it more. And I did. And I started looking into it. Now they were making two other options. Either the magnet school in the middle of the city, which was the safe haven for parents like them. And if they didn't get into that school, then they left the district and they went to private schools. Right. But it was people demystifying the process for me. What if I had never even known to maybe think to do a different thing for him, right? And to look. And it was them. And I was like, sometimes white people are the talisman. They know opportunity and system. You follow them sometimes.
Right. Hey, anybody who knows how the thing works, you should at least listen when they have some insight, I guess.
Absolutely.
So, all right. So I have one last question just about your experience, and then we'll work towards wrapping this up. But I'm just curious, given your experience in school, and then given your experiences with your son and all of your children's educations, what drove you? Well, I can probably guess what drove you to get involved in a school board, but what was your motivation for that involvement, right? Like at what point did you decide, like, I'm going to get involved in this sort of policy level on the local level? And what was the goal? Like, if you had to pick two initiatives that you were trying to get done in the local community, what for you took it from something that you cared about personally to something that you cared about and acted on publicly?
Man, that's a deep question. So I will say this, what I told you earlier about doing service industry work to me was like a real clarion call that my life was about to be like something I never thought. Like, I didn't grow up saying that I wanted to do service industry work for substandard money and be living couch surfing and, kind of living check to check in ways that was like always really fragile. So the drive to making the connection, bingo, this is what education is about. It's about not wanting to do this for the rest of my life. So I kind of felt like I had wiped out. When I became a parent, I became a militant parent, just in that I made the connection finally. I was like, okay, I'm 22. I'm in this situation because of not taking seriously my education, like not seeing the connection between that success. Right. So with my own kid, that decision that we had to make to put him in a charter school was a decision. It was a pivotal moment for me, because at that point I started recruiting his friends too. I started becoming a town crier, going to his friends and saying, just like the folks had told me to think about a different decision, I paid it forward. And at some point I thought, I'm not just the dude who's like ignorant about the schools anymore. I'm like, I actually have something of value that I can help people with, because I was becoming an activist in it. Like, it was becoming a passion to basically say, if this has always been possible, I don't know why we haven't been doing this, right? And the moment that I became that person where I said to myself, like, I have more to give in this situation. I got my own kid to safe harbor, but there are all these other kids that he was like friends with, someone who went to that assigned school. It was just clear as day that they were living a different experience. And that was my motivating factor that like changed me in ways of like, I'm going to just like scream it from the rooftops. I'm going to be an activist. I'm going to just say the thing that, you know, no one else can say because I had nothing to lose.
Yeah.
Nobody knew who I was. I was just an inner city dad. I could shout from the rooftops. And I started going to school board meetings. I started becoming a problem. I wanted to be a problem. And then I ran for school board. And I don't know that I expected to win, but I won. Right. I got 42,000 votes, put me on the school board. The Democratic convention put me through in the first round, which is a big deal for us. We call it the first round club, which is when you're at the convention, most times it takes you multiple rounds of voting to get the nomination. Mine was like on the first nomination, the first round, and I won. And then I was on the school board and I was like, oh man, this is different now. So now that I'm on the board, you have to give me the answers that I was asking you before. And that was life-changing.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the things I think people underestimate about the school board is that you can ask the staff for information and it is the staff's job to provide you with the information to make your decisions. Now, don't get me wrong. There are plenty of school administrations that find interesting ways to not answer questions or give half answers. And sometimes that's a separate problem, but
and what you
probably
say
one of the most empowering
member,
things, you know,
when that happens, what you say is, I'm an elected official. So you can play with me on this if you want to, but when I call the press, they come running. So if I want to hold a press conference on any given day of the week about anything, I can fill the room with journalists. So keep playing with me when I ask you for information and not giving me the information I want, because I know so much more now. I was an activist before, but I do want to say as a shout out to everybody listening and to you and everyone else, I do believe that everybody should run for school board once.
Hey, it's on my potential agenda. My kids are 2 and 4, and that's what I've thought about. And it's just because I'm like, I have the experience for me, you know, in the classroom, but then I also, you know, I've been having these conversations and I've probably learned more about the institution of school by running a podcast for a while and asking sort of big questions, philosophical questions, than I probably did in any part of my actual teacher preparation. Like I better understand what I'm doing now because of these conversations that I'm choosing to have than from any class that I ever took, from any series of classes I ever took. And so, and I think about like, what do I do with it? You know, like how does that become actionable? You know, it's nice to talk. I love that people listen. At some point, it needs to turn into an activity. You know, knowledge is inert until you have the options. And then, so I'm starting to think like, so what do I do with this? Or, you know, hopefully people are listening. They're thinking, what do they do with it? And I would agree. You know, whether you actually run for the school board or not, I think it would be a wonderful thing if more people showed up to those meetings, and not just because you're mad about a snow day call or, you know, because you're questioning a book in the classroom. Like you should just show up to a random one once in a while just to see how that business is run. Because I think people would plug in a little more, and to your point, maybe make better decisions.
I want to put that on a t-shirt. I just can't say it any better. A lot of times the people who show up the most are the ones who are asking for very inequitable things.
Yeah.
So the people who are for equity and down for really equitable things oftentimes aren't in the room when some decisions are being made. And what you just said, number one, I hope you run for school board. I hope to put you on the hook here right now for people that listen to you to say that you should run for school board at some point, and then you should demystify it for somebody else after you do it to get them to run too.
Yeah. It's one of the, I don't want to say easy isn't the right word, but it's one of the most direct paths to influence your local community and a large number of people in it. And ideally, you know, we'd be doing this in positive ways to uplift people, but it's one of the most direct routes to do it. I see a lot of people trying to have positive impacts in a lot of really abstract ways, and getting involved locally is a good way to do it. So, all right, I have 2 questions left and we're done on this thing. The one that you know is we're going to end with a couple of book and movie recommendations. The one before that is you get an open mic, you know, and I know you got your own podcast, so you can plug them now, but you all obviously already have your own microphone. But if there's anything else that you want to say or state or clarify that we either didn't cover, we did too fast, is there anything that you'd like to put out there before we wrap up? Just make sure the audience understands where you're coming from.
No, I mean, I would just honestly say have an open mind about education, especially as it concerns people of color. And I think like maximum freedom for people of color is to be able to have self-determination, to be able to say, even when you don't agree with it or don't believe that it's right for you or whatever, like really to put in check your sense of wanting to control what other people do, especially when they're people of color. There are 400 years of substandard kind of rights within the United States. I think people of color, and specifically Black people, have to come into their own in terms of deciding these things for themselves. And having options is really important. My main indictment of the current education system is that everybody knows that it's rigged and they won't do anything about it. The way that we assign kids to school, residential address as a way to assign kids to schools or to limit their options is completely it's known and it's inequitable, and we know it. It's the blueprint for inequity. And Tim DeRoche has a book on it that talks a lot about, the redlining, and it's got some pretty jarring examples. To me, it's like the Jonathan Kozol's Savage Inequality book of the moment. It's the one that will show you, no, this isn't by accident. It's a blueprint. It's a blueprint on how you actually line people up into different tracks of opportunity on purpose. So I would definitely tell people to take a look at that. Take a look at Peter Gray's work. Peter Gray is an author who does a lot around kind of like unstructured learning and unstructured learning time. It's not for everybody.
He's the unschooling guy, right? Free to Learn, I think, is the big book.
Free to Learn is the name of the book. Yeah. And I've interviewed him. He's great. Carrie McDonald is someone you might interview too, her book was great. I haven't reached out to her, but the book was, Unschooled was fantastic. She'd be a great interview because she's amazing. And then I think the book that honestly I would probably point to the most for folks is Educational Pluralism by Ashley Berner. And that book did a lot for me to, number one, know that I wasn't crazy in terms of like there needing to be different types of schools for different types of kids. But one of the jarring things out of that book to me, it wasn't really jarring, but I mean, one of the big points of learning for me was just that the United States is actually out of sync with the rest of the developed world when it comes to school choice. Like the developed world, England, the Netherlands, everybody else in the world actually funds all kinds of schools. So you can go to a Muslim school, you can go to a Catholic school, you can go to a traditional school, you can go to whatever. Like we're like a outlier in not funding other kinds of schools, and I did not know that. Right? We that's our thing, right? We do it with healthcare. We do it with a million things, right? We do so many things different. I'm glad you said healthcare. We should call it single payer education. So if we could get single payer education, then everybody would agree with it. Yeah, right. So that's all I got for books. I know in the beginning you said movies too. I would say this: The Matrix. Nice. For me, is the best analog for public education to me. And Pink Floyd's The Wall, actually, I just thought was like, it was my everything in one movie when I saw it the first time, and then the second time and the third time. So it might explain a lot about me if people were to watch that. It is completely random, but just funny anecdote. My son's 4.5, right? And it's like pandemic and whatever, but he really wanted to go to school just to be around kids because we pulled him from daycare. So like, oh, we're working from home. And so he's been going to like half day preschool, and it just started being a drag in the winter. And he's like, I don't want to go. I'm like, well, I don't really want you bringing germs home, and your mom's not working much right now. And it was like, cool. So we pulled him, but in his next to last week of school, we heard on the way to school, he always says he wants rock and roll. And I don't know where he came up with that, because I never was like, rock and roll, he demands it, And so we heard another brick in the wall. Yes. And he was like, this is cool. And 2 days later, on a morning he didn't want to go to school, he said, can we hear that song about the brick teacher? And I said, the brick teacher, what? And he said it back to me, and I was like, oh, holy crap. Like, this is why you're not going anymore. Like, this kid just like leapt ahead of me in terms of this whole school choice conversation on a Pink Floyd song and a couple of days he was bored. That's good. That tells you it's timeless. If you think of how old that song is, old it is, it's timeless. High quality. And actually, please do go watch that. People listening, watch that movie and just think about the deep themes that it has in it about alienation in public schools. and what we do to kids. Teachers would love it. I think your son's got great taste, man. I love it.
Well, let's hope that continues.
And listen, so folks can find me on Twitter at Citizen Stewart. They can, if they want to find my main organization, it's called Brightbeam Network, and you can find us at brightbeamnetwork.org. If it's just about me and you just want to connect or talk to me, you can Citizen.Education is my website where you can catch me, where you can find me.
Right. So that was it. That was the last thing there. And then, you also are host or co-host of the 8 Black Hands podcast and UnPublic podcast, where you go live Tuesday, Thursday, Friday. I really, really appreciate you taking the time to talk. This has been fantastic. And, I always come in with a lot to think about. And I know it was a good episode if I leave with even more to think about. And we certainly did that. So we have been talking with Chris Citizen Stewart. This has been the ClassCast Podcast. You can find the ClassCast Podcast on all major streaming services, plus YouTube and www.classcastpodcast.com. Thank you very much. Have a great day.